So having laid the groundwork then for what racial battle fatigue is, as well as the larger context that is impacting what the experience of racial battle fatigue, and I want to spend the remainder of the time really talking about some research that I conducted a couple years ago. So I noticed that when I was talking to my colleagues of color, namely my Black colleagues, they would often say to me, Stephen, I'm feeling really exhausted. Like I'm feeling like I don't know how to show up and teach this class that I have to teach. Or I often talk about the racism I'm experiencing, and my white peers or colleagues, they minimize it or they don't really understand what I'm saying. And I kept hearing these smaller anecdotal stories from my Black colleagues. And so I wanted to understand, well, how are other people experiencing or navigating this? So I did a study where I interviewed with a research team, 35 Black student affairs educators at various institutions. Some of these were entry-level professionals. So some of them were folks who were resident directors in residence halls. Some were academic advisors. Some were more mid-level professionals. So like an assistant director of an office, or a director of an office. And then a few were also more senior level. So a dean of students or the vice president of student affairs. So again, these were 35 Black student affairs people across various institutions to understand not only how they were experiencing racial battle fatigue, but I wanted to know more specifically, what do you do to take care of yourself in the midst of this, right? So what strategies do you use to work to self-care or heal in the midst of racial battle fatigue? As we analyzed the data from the study, we noticed that there were some commonalities between Black men and Black women in the study, but that Black women were also expressing something that was qualitatively different than their Black male peers. And so we decided to look just at the data from the 24 Black women participants and center their stories. And so that's what I'm going to share with you tonight, is what we found from the interviews that we conducted with these 24 Black women student affairs educators. So this particular quote from Trinity highlights the way in which I'm going to talk about what we learned from the study. So Trinity said, as Black women, because we have been those nurturing women, we say that we can do it. We'll do that because we know we got to get our foot in the door. But then it's like, who looks out for us? We look out for everybody else because that's what we do as nurturers. But who looks out for us? That's problematic to me. So Trinity frames the way in which I titled my talk here today, who looks out for us? And again, that question of like, who is there to support and look out for Black women when they are looking out for so many other people? And so there are 4 particular ways that participants said their colleagues are not looking out for them. And I'll share data from each of these. One was seeing Black women as superwomen. So as the source of service and help who can take care of everybody else's needs, while no one else was taking care of their needs. Secondly, they talked about what the experience of gendered racial battle fatigue feels like. And then third, they talked about how often when Black folks were killed, that there was often silence from their white colleagues around this and how that exacerbated their racial battle fatigue. And then lastly, they talked about self-care and healing. So I'm going to talk about these four findings and give some data and voices from participants to share with you to help paint a picture of how they were saying their colleagues were not looking out for them in their racial battle fatigue that they were experiencing. So let's start with Black women as superwomen. And this manifested in 3 different ways: the roles and responsibilities of the superwoman, superwoman expectations in white spaces, and then Black men and non-Black people of color. So that's what that acronym is, NBPOC, non-Black people of color, reinforcing superwoman expectations. So starting with the roles and responsibilities of the superwoman. So Destiny shared two powerful quotes in this particular section. She said, "I'm not very motherly, so it's really annoying to be put in this kind of mammy type role, if you will. I'm nothing like that." Later on in her interview, Destiny said, "My students see me as, Destiny, come and help me, come protect me from this, come and hold me, come and take care of me." And I'm like, who's taking care of me? I'm tired too, and I'm always the sassy one. I'm always the one that has to be the mother figure. I'm always those kinds of things. Destiny's quotes, I think, are really powerful in part one, because she points out this notion of the mammy type role, which again is the way in which during the era of slavery, right, Black women were often expected to take care of their slave owners' children, right? And so they were positioned as like mammies. And so in contemporary present day society, Destiny was saying sometimes that's how she feels she's treated by her peers, right? As like this person who's supposed to come take care of them, and that she doesn't get to center her own needs because she's always having to worry about other people's needs. Superwoman expectations in white spaces. Becky said, my hair naturally is a giant afro, but I got a new job, so I have to ease in. Even though I'm not going to start no Angela Davis type riot, I think that my afro communicates that. It's not fair, but it's the reality. I love my afro. It's really big and it's really healthy. If I'm going to keep my new job, I have to ease it for about 6 months. I wish I could just exist and be me and not have to worry about all the things of being a Black woman. So in this particular case, Becky worked at a predominantly white institution where she's one of the few women of color at her institution. She talked about how, because of that, she often has to pay attention to how she dresses. And so because of the ways in which her colleagues would often make comments about her hair or ask to touch her hair, like all of these things that she has to pay attention to that, which is exhausting, right? So that also then contributes to the racial battle fatigue that she's experiencing. Unfortunately, it wasn't just Black women's white colleagues who are also harmful at times. Sometimes Black men and also non-Black people of color also reinforce these expectations. So Trinity said, in dealing with racial battle fatigue, seeing more unity between Black women and Black men, because Black men watch stuff happen to Black women, and it's like, oh, okay, she'll be okay. No, bro, that ain't how it happens. So again, not only do her white colleagues expect that Black women are these superhuman characters who nobody else has to prioritize their needs and can take care of everybody else, but sometimes too, even folks who were supposed to look out for them most, Black men and other non-Black people of color, also reinforce these superwoman expectations at times too. The second finding then, it relates to how gendered racism makes Black women feel. So one of the common ways in which she described it was that they just feel exhausted. And Kathy said, I was explaining to one of my coworkers, it's gendered racial battle fatigue. It's kind of like wearing a heavy coat that's wet that you didn't pick to put on you, but it's on you. And even when you feel like you have a lot of strength, at some point that coat just gets heavier. So imagine wearing this heavy coat, right? It's that extra weight, that extra burden that I was talking about earlier. Another one of the participants talked about that she does CrossFit a lot. And one of the things that she said that she does in CrossFit is that they often wear a weighted vest. So it makes the CrossFit routine more difficult, more challenging. And so she described this as like racial battle fatigue is like when she's often having to wear that weighted vest around. It's this extra layer of weight that is on her that she's often having to navigate. It also makes participants feel angry. So Destiny said, I think a lot about anger, but it's more on the lines of suppressed anger. It's like I can't be quite as raw as I would like to be. So there's a stereotype, right, that exists in our society around the angry Black woman. And even if you, I recently listened to Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, and she talked about this notion of as the first lady and a Black woman, how she often had to suppress her anger, right? As to not be portrayed as the angry Black woman. And so many of the participants often talked about that too, and how that made them angry, but they couldn't express that anger, right? They were often having to suppress it, to let it go. And then finally, it also made them feel hopeless. I feel like I just can't win, said Sarah. It's exactly what it says. It's just fatigue. I get tired of educating people. I get tired of telling them, no, you shouldn't say that to a student. You shouldn't say that to another employee. It gets overwhelming sometimes. I go home and my husband laughs sometimes. He's like, I can't believe you deal with that and you work in higher ed. I'm like, yeah, it's a battle. It's exactly what it is. Sometimes I just can't deal with it today. I get tired. So there's this perception, right, that those of us who work in higher ed, that we work in these very progressive spaces where this shouldn't happen, right? But yet Sarah was saying that even her husband said, wow, I can't believe that this is happening to you even in higher ed. So again, it's that feeling of being hopeless that she's often having to educate people about what they shouldn't do, right? And that also contributes then to her racial battle fatigue. So finding number 3 then relates to how white silence about Black death impacts Black women. So TC said, I work with these people 8 hours a day and we do staff bonding. You know, we celebrate birthdays and all these special days, but it was something serious and we didn't check in with each other. So TC is referring to, she was referring to when Michael Brown was shot and killed in 2014. And it was a vivid memory that she had. She went to work that next day and she said folks just moved on business as usual. Like there was no acknowledgement that perhaps she was in pain, that this tragedy had happened. And yet her white colleagues were often silent about it. And she needed them to speak up, to let her, to engage with her, to ask how she was doing, right? But that silence was again exacerbating it. So when stuff is happening in our world, like we have to acknowledge it. So that's one of the things that TC mentioned. And then finally, participants talked about how they work to try to heal or engage in self-care in the midst of racial battle fatigue. So Zuri said, I always have mixed feelings about the word self-care as it's so tied to capitalism. I think about healing in a very communal way, because I depend on a lot of people to help me heal, to listen to me, to support me. So focusing on the self, I think is important, but I think community care, I think is in the context of working in higher ed, I think is more important to me and how we help each other take care of ourselves. So what you see here is participants wrestling with the distinction between self-care and healing as ways to address racial battle fatigue. So they often said self-care was more temporary fixes. So these were things like exercising, getting a pedicure, relaxing, watching TV, things to temporarily take their minds off of what they were experiencing, but it didn't really address the root of the problem, which again was the racism and sexism that they were navigating. So healing for them was a more sustainable long-term process that was addressing the root of the issue, and which often occurred in the midst of a community of hanging out with other Black folks that they could process with.